Okay, great. Thank you very much. We are really excited to be here today. Thank you everyone for joining. We're happy to share the results from our report, which is now up on the website, on Solar United Nations website, Neighbors website. And I want to give a quick introduction to the report authors, and then we have about a 30-minute presentation for everyone to go through some of the details that we've included in our report. So I'm Kelly Stevens. I'm assistant professor at the University of Central Florida. I'm in the School of Public Administration and a member of the RISES cluster. RISES stands for Resilient, Intelligent, and Sustainable Energy Systems Research Cluster. It's an interdisciplinary group of faculty and researchers at UCF working together on these important issues. I'll let my co-authors go ahead and introduce themselves.
Yeah, thanks, Kelly. And hi, everyone. My name is Gilbert Michaud. I am assistant professor of practice at the Voinovich School of Leadership and Public Affairs at Ohio University. I'm here in Columbus, Ohio, and also excited about this report release. My background is in economics and public policy related to solar energy deployment, and so helped a lot with this report in terms of state-level economic development and economic impact analysis. We've done some environmental type analyses as well. And also shout out to my colleague, David Jenkins, who's a research associate in my department at the school, who's also a co-author on this study, and I believe is here as well. He and I led the charge from the OU side in terms of a lot of the economic and environmental impact modeling, which we'll talk about in the latter half of the presentation. So back to you, Kelly.
Great, so let's get started. So first, what we have here is a snapshot of what's included in our report. So we have an overview of the table of contents, just to give everyone a quick preview of what we cover. We begin the report with a quick introduction to what are PPAs and general overview and discussing the legality of them here in Florida. And we'll take a brief look at some of the changes in PPA regulation across the country and what that has done for other states. Then we get more into the meat of the report, where we look at 3 distinct case studies and present what solar PPA could do for each of these organizations in terms of electricity savings, jobs created, and environmental impacts. The 3 cases we're highlighting include the City of Orlando, Osceola School District, and First Unitarian Church in Orlando. So these are all in Central Florida. These are great cases because they are all interested in a different size solar array. And we believe that this range really presents relatable information for other organizations who are considering adding solar, who might also benefit from a solar PPA. Section 4 is where we get into the work that Dr. Michaud's group has done at Ohio University, taking a look closer at what solar PPAs could do statewide for the state of Florida. And they go through extensive modeling of the economic and environmental impacts of third-party PPAs in Florida. And he will cover that later in the presentation. So first, what are PPAs? This is power purchase agreements. We call them PPAs frequently because it's a bit shorter. But they are a solar financing option that helps organizations avoid large upfront costs of installing solar array. Instead, a third party owns, operates, and maintains the solar array or the PV system. So referring to the figure on the right, there's 2 main parties involved. There's the clean energy buyer, which is the organization interested in solar, and the clean energy supplier, which is the solar installer that would own, operate, and maintain the PV system on the energy buyer's property. This is sometimes referred to as a third-party owner, with the additional party being the organization's utility company, which is not included in this figure. But we're often PPAs, primarily association between these 2 parties. Because the energy supplier owns the PV array, they cover the upfront cost of installing a solar array, which is typically a really big hurdle for organizations to come up with the upfront cost to build and install solar on their property. The clean energy supplier, since they own the PV array, they then sell that electricity generated by the solar array back to the clean energy buyer or the organization, the customer, at a reduced rate typically reduced lower than your current electricity rate. So the energy buyer is saving money by producing electricity and buying it from their clean energy supplier. When they enter in a PPA, they usually use long-term contracts that establish what those electricity rates are going to be for a long term. That's usually over 15 to 25 years. The energy supplier is able to provide a lower cost of electricity through lower marginal cost of solar generation, and also because they're receiving a federal investment tax credit, which they receive when they fill out their federal taxes, and it lowers the overall cost of the PV system since they are the legal owners of the system. Some of those savings are then passed along back to the consumer or the customer over here. There are several different versions of a solar PPA, but in this report, what we're really focusing on are non-utility PPAs, which are usually smaller scale, and on-site solar arrays, where the solar array is actually located on the clean energy buyer's property. And we're focusing on public organizations and nonprofits rather than very small systems for residents. So next we talk a little bit about PPAs in Florida and across the country. So third-party PPAs like the one I just described are actually not allowed here in Florida. It's very difficult to do. In Florida, we have regulatory hurdles in the state statutes that make it very difficult for these third-party PPAs to exist. In Florida, anyone who sells electricity, regardless of how much, falls under the definition of a public utility. So this would include those clean energy suppliers I just talked about that own and operate the PV system in a third-party PPA and lump them into the same category of other large utility companies such as Florida Power and Light, Gulf Power, and Duke Energy. This is unnecessarily burdensome for the energy companies, the energy suppliers to comply with, and essentially prohibits third-party PPAs from existing in the state. However, other states across the country have made it much easier for PPAs to operate. The map to the right shows 28 states plus DC, they're colored in yellow, where PPAs are authorized or currently in use. Most of these states are in the Northeast and the Southwest, where solar generation ranks particularly high. Arizona is a really great example to look at. Arizona used to have prohibitive language like we have in Florida, lumping in those clean energy suppliers in with the utilities. And in 2010, the Arizona Corporation Commission exempted third-party PPAs from the definition of public utilities when providing services to schools, governments, or nonprofits. This would do a lot for Florida if we were able to make the same regulatory changes. However, in Florida, we're one of 7 states across the country where PPAs are prohibited or otherwise disallowed. States like this, there's language or explicit or implicit language that makes it very difficult to have a PPA. But to change these rules, the Florida statutes, we could pursue revising the Florida statutes or propose a ballot amendment for citizens to vote on, which would have the same effect of legalizing PPAs in Florida. So in the rest of this report, we consider what could happen if PPAs were allowed in Florida. How would solar grow? And what are some of the economic and environmental benefits from this change? First, we consider what PPAs could do for 3 specific organizations. We evaluate the City of Orlando, Osceola School District, and First Unitarian Church of Orlando, all located in Central Florida. These are all public organizations or nonprofits that are interested in adding solar, but based on the nature and size of each organization, they're interested in different solar array sizes. Based on input from these organizations, we model what would happen if PPAs were legal in Florida and if they were able to pursue new solar projects through a PPA. These 3 cases provide examples for other public organizations and nonprofits who are considering adding solar and outlines what PPAs could do for them. So first we start with our largest case. This is the City of Orlando. Orlando has the goal to meet all municipal electricity demand from renewable sources by 2030. To help meet that goal, they're interested in installing more rooftop solar on municipal buildings where it's feasible. They already have some rooftop solar. They also have some off-site solar, but they're interested in building more on-site, on municipally owned buildings where, again, where it's feasible. So the City of Orlando provided us with details regarding 14 municipally owned buildings that are good candidates for rooftop solar. And so our numbers are based on the electricity demand and energy savings from those 14 buildings. And we estimate that they could add 18 megawatts of solar on these 14 buildings. And then we go through some of the calculations to decide to show what this additional solar could do for the city using a third-party PPA. Sometimes we use kilowatts and megawatts and kilowatt hours. So let me just clarify what this means. 1,000 kilowatts is equal to 1 megawatt. So we talk about 18 megawatts for the City of Orlando. That's 18,000 kilowatts. Kilowatts and megawatts are a measure of power generating capacity. So it's a kind of gives us a sense of the size, while a kilowatt hour is a measure of energy, which includes a time component, which is usually used to describe consumption and generation. So we have kilowatt hours here, electricity consumption. For the City of Orlando, again, just from those 14 buildings that we're targeting in our study here. What we find if they add 18 megawatts of solar is that it would cost around $29 million to install it. But again, that installation cost is going to be paid for by the third party or by the clean energy supplier. And so the City of Orlando does not have to cover that upfront cost. They're financing that through the PPA. What we also find is that if they pursued a PPA for this 18 megawatts and estimate that they pay about 25% lower than their current retail electricity prices, which is a reasonable estimate based on our research, that they would save around $415,000 a year in their electricity bills by offsetting some of their electricity use from this on-site solar that's financed through a third-party PPA. Later in the presentation, Dr. Michaud's group is going to explain a little bit more details on how they calculated some of these economic benefits and environmental benefits. But I'll just say quickly that we estimate using Dr. Michaud's models that this 18 megawatts of solar would support 232 solar construction jobs in the state of Florida, and then generate an economic impact of about $34 million. And the environmental benefit would be equivalent to taking over 1,000 gasoline-powered cars off the road. So the greenhouse gas emissions reductions from offsetting their electricity, some of their electricity from their traditional sources, would be significant. So that was our large case. If we go down to our medium-sized case, we start talking about the Osceola School District, also located in Central Florida. It's a public organization that has been interested in adding additional solar. They actually already have a fair amount across their buildings or across the school district, but they're interested in adding an additional 2 megawatts of solar to several specific buildings. According to the Brighter Future report that was published in 2020, which was published by Generation 180 in partnership with the Solar Energy Industries Association and the Solar Foundation, find that schools particularly benefit from third-party PPAs. That report finds that over 79% of all solar installed on schools is financed through a third-party PPA, which is astonishing. Part of the reason for that is that schools particularly operate under constrained budgets. And so finding the upfront costs for financing and building an on-site solar array and paying for it themselves is very difficult for schools to do. And so again, they benefit by doing a third-party PPA where they can finance it through another party that owns, operates, and maintains the system. So Osceola School District is very active in reducing their carbon footprint and has the first public K-12 net zero energy school in Florida. It has about 228 kilowatts of solar currently installed. And this is the Neo City Academy. Pictured here, it was built in 2019, and it's doing a lot for the school district so far. But if they were to add an additional 2 megawatts of solar through a third-party PPA, they estimate that they would distribute that over 3 schools, 3 additional school buildings. And so the numbers that they provided us with here are a little bit different from the city of Orlando, where they gave us the total electricity consumption for the school district. So it's not an apples to apples comparison. This is where we're looking at electricity consumption across the entire school district, rather than just targeting those 3 schools. But we still find that if they installed 2 megawatts of solar on those schools, they would save around $90,000 per year in their electricity bills. Again, assuming a reduced electricity rate of about 25% compared to what they're currently paying in the district. So the last case that I wanted to go through is our smaller case. This is the First Unitarian Church of Orlando. They currently do not have any solar on their campus, but they've been interested in it for a long time. But they've done some recent renovations to the campus, to the buildings. And so finding, again, that upfront cost, or finding the capital for that upfront cost, has been difficult for them to do. So a third-party PPA would be particularly beneficial for them. It would allow them to save on their electricity bills without any of those upfront costs of installing solar. They are on the smaller side compared to the other 2 cases, but we actually think this is really comparable for a lot of nonprofits and faith-based organizations across the state. They, based on our estimates, could install up to 63 kilowatts of solar on their campus. And we find that they would reduce their electricity bills by about $2,000 per year, again, assuming that reduced electricity rate through the third-party PPA. This money that they would save would be put back into their ministries and some of their social justice work in the community. So now I'm going to turn it over to my co-author, Dr. Michaud, to go through some of those details of the economic and environmental impacts of solar expansion using third-party PPAs.
Thanks, Dr. Stevens. If you could move to the next slide, that'd be wonderful. Appreciate the background on PPAs, really intriguing and interesting case studies. Now we're going to segue, as mentioned, to sort of our state level impacts, right? Myself and my team have helped for, at the micro level, at the case study level, with understanding some of the, exogenous shock to local economies, what this means in terms of, as Kelly mentioned, construction jobs or equivalent cars taken off of the road. But really the grunt of the work on our end was modeling this at the state level, right? If we had a change that would legalize or enable PPAs to develop, what impacts might we see all across the state, being agnostic to sort of time and how this, PPA solar related deployment would develop. And so our first step in that process really was to try to understand what's a feasible deployment scenario at the state level, right? So you can follow along on the figure here and understand sort of our 3 different scenarios that we developed, sort of a low, moderate, and high deployment scenario. And our first step to accomplish this task was to say, hey, okay, how much solar is currently installed in Florida, right? And then how much of that is non-utility solar, really the area of focus for these, PPA related deployments. And so then we had to look to other states and actually, sort of national level data to better discern how much solar might grow by enabling or legalizing PPAs. It's really hard to project out what that might look like in Florida, but we can point to sort of other states and see what they're doing. The number that we kept seeing was sort of the 65% threshold of newly installed solar that could come from PPAs or that are coming from PPAs in other states. And so we said, okay, if Florida, akin to other states, meets this sort of threshold, how much solar does the state have to get to, and how much of that is sort of newly installed capacity? And if you go all the way to the right, you can see that calculation amounted to 1,544 megawatts of additional solar that we thought was a pretty realistic or feasible deployment scenario. looking ahead to the future if PPAs were legalized. And to be, sort of safe and understand what different types of scenarios might be, right? We said, let's take 25% less than that as our lower bound and 25% greater than that as our sort of upper bound. And that way we have a range of numbers to work with if, different sort of deployments might happen from PPAs. If you move your eyes back up to the top and left-hand side of the screen, you can see we sort of rounded these numbers off for sort of ease of analysis and erring on the side of simplicity, right? So again, our sort of expectation is we might be looking at, in our moderate scenario, about 1,600 megawatts or 1.6 gigawatts, which is the conversion there. We use gigawatts in our subsequent slides. As Dr. Stevens mentioned, this is sort of a conversion, right? So 1,000 megawatts is 1 gigawatt. It's just a different way to express that same installed capacity value. But at any rate, so our low scenario, we projected, about 1,200 megawatts or 1.2 gigawatts. Again, moderate scenario, 1,600 megawatts or about 1.6 gigawatts. And our highest scenario that we modeled was 2,000 megawatts, i.e. 2.0 gigawatts, a nice round number to go with. Next slide, please. So our first sort of task here was to model the economic impacts. And we did pretty sort of standard and traditional models for this using IO methods, input-output type methods to model, what the exogenous shock of growing solar in Florida might mean in terms of, new jobs, wages, et cetera. We utilized NREL, the National Renewable Energy Laboratory's JEDI tool or model, which is an acronym for Jobs and Economic Development Impact. We at OU have a lot of different sort of skills and software that we utilize. We opted to use JEDI here because it offered sort of the most granularity and specificity with regard to updating model inputs, local multipliers, Florida-specific solar job wages, module costs, et cetera, et cetera. So I'd encourage folks to check out the report and dive into the methodological assumptions and variables that we updated and used. One thing I do want to point out is we're largely modeling small and large commercial systems here, especially when we revert back to the case studies, right? We think of the church, pretty small scale, deployment compared to, what the city of Orlando or other larger applications might be. So there we're modeling more of a small commercial system. When we're thinking about, 500 kilowatts, 1 megawatt, those type sizes, we're really modeling large commercial systems. One assumption I do want to point out is we're assuming 73% Florida-specific labor and 30% Florida-specific materials. This was a number that we inserted by looking at sort of the current scale of solar workforce and material suppliers that do currently exist in Florida. Again, we're taking this sort of snapshot approach, right? We know that sort of if you build it, they will come, right? If Florida passed PPA legislation or other more supportive solar policies, we would see an influx of, installers, material suppliers, and other folks. But as we currently stand, this is sort of what might be feasible. And thus our numbers and estimates represent sort of conservative estimates, right? If we ramp these percentages up, my point is to 100% local labor and 100% Florida specific materials, our impacts would be even larger. One other thing I want to point out to folks on the right-hand side of the screen is when we're talking about total economic impacts, we can really sort of slice this down into three discernible categories, right? So typically when we think about like jobs or employment, we're thinking about the total number of jobs supported or something like that, which we'll get into on the next slide. But it's really a byproduct of different effects that we feel, right? So in the most direct type effects, we think of installers that are on site actually building a solar energy facility. In a more indirect way, in the indirect effect, here we're thinking about vendors, material suppliers, and those types of folks. So PV manufacturers, wiring and racking systems, even things like legal services or accountants, et cetera, supporting jobs through that sort of lens. And then furthest to the right, we have what we call the induced effect. This is sort of the folks in those aforementioned categories spending money in their local economies, right? At grocery stores, restaurants, doing sort of normal economic activity and thus supporting, those types of folks in their respective industries. And so when we sum these things together, that's sort of the total impact that we see or realize, but I just want folks to be very clear and good consumers of these data and what they mean. Next slide, please. So we first sort of look at construction impacts. We break this down into two core phases, right? Our construction phase impacts and our operations and maintenance or O&M phase impacts. So let's first talk about construction through the employment lens. This is sort of a one-time, to build out to these deployment scenarios type impacts that we're seeing. Everything that you'll see here, again, has our three deployment scenarios of low, moderate, and high, 1.2, 1.6, and 2.0 gigawatts, respectively, as I mentioned. And then again, broken down here in these bar charts in terms of direct, indirect, and induced effects, as I mentioned on the prior slide. So I won't read all the numbers to you. If you look on the furthest to the left chunk of that bar in the darkest orange, you'll see, if this is of importance to you, sort of the direct jobs is sort of, again, on-site, building, rooftop or ground-mounted solar systems, 5,000, 7,000, 9,000, give or take, jobs supported in this construction phase. And really, the bigger number and perhaps more compelling is when we sum all of the impacts that we're feeling from this shock to the economy, this positive change, if you will, our total job figures, right? So here we see 15,500, and I'm rounding a bit, 20,500, and almost 26,000 jobs supported in the construction phase to build out to 2 gigawatts of solar in Florida if PPAs were legalized. Next slide, please. And then we can also look at the economic impacts, right? So new dollars being pumped into the state economy. Again, sort of same setup here in terms of our deployment scenarios and the three different effects that we see here, and with our totals being on the right-hand side. Really compelling numbers, really high numbers, if I may, $2.3 billion, $3.1 billion, and almost $4 billion, respectively, across our deployment scenarios. So again, it's a nice sort of number to hang our hats on and say, hey, if we legalize PPAs and if we build out to 2 gigawatts or 2,000 megawatts, we're pumping in almost $4 billion of new money into the state economy. Next slide. And again, sort of in order, right? We can look at, okay, we've built out these solar projects amounting to these scenarios in their construction phase. Now, what do we sort of see in terms of economic impacts in our O&M, our operations and maintenance phase? These are annual values, just to be very clear with you all. Again, same setup across our deployment scenarios and the different types of effects that we see. One of the efficiencies, I'd argue, of solar, in fact, is they are pretty low maintenance type facilities, right, in terms of electricity generation. Not only clean electricity, but lower maintenance. And so the numbers here are sort of inherently lower, but I don't think that's a knock on solar in particular. Our totals, again, to the right-hand side, 139 jobs, 184 jobs, and 230 jobs, respectively, across our scenarios. And again, for the second time, these are annual numbers. So we can think of this over the life of a system, right? So if we, say, have a 25-year PPA, you can very simply stated multiply these values by 25 and try to understand what those impacts might be. Let's now go to the next slide and look at the economic impacts in this same phase, in the O&M phase. Again, same type of setup and also annual values that we're looking at here. Again, the totals on the right-hand side of your screen, and we're rounding quite a bit. I'd encourage folks to check out the report and see the more sort of specific numbers, but to round off into some nice even numbers, $16 million in our lowest deployment scenario, $22 million in our moderate, and $27 million in our higher scenario. Again, multiply these values by whatever year sort of our life of the systems might be relevant. Next slide, please. And then I'll quickly go through some environmental and pollution impact sort of models that we did. Again, I'd encourage folks to check out the report for a more specific sort of description and detail of our methods and inputs. Basically, what we wanted to do is say, okay, how much energy are we producing through these deployment scenarios from PPAs in the state of Florida? And what might that mean in terms of, annual greenhouse gas emission mitigation? So we made a number of sort of assumptions. We used capacity factors from NREL, like I mentioned, the National Renewable Energy Lab and their annual technology baseline data in terms of, to understand production, in terms of pollution impacts and that type of analysis. We basically looked at, the emissions rates of all of the current sort of electricity generation in Florida from EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. And then we modeled, the very pointed energy transitions that we're seeing, right, in terms of fossil fuels to renewable energy deployment that we're already seeing across the country and also in the state of Florida. Decommissioning of coal-fired power plants, adding more solar to the grid. What does this mean in terms of emissions? And one thing that we did that was really cool for a more sort of layperson digestible, if you will, type variable was equated this to like equivalent cars taken off the road, like Dr. Stevens mentioned, right? So we said, here's how much greenhouse gas emissions we're saving. And here's basically the equivalency of how many cars we're taking off of the road. We're not physically, literally taking a car off of the road, of course, but we're just giving you sort of a layperson variable to hang our hat on. And you can see some of the inputs and data sources there. Next slide. So real quick here in terms of production, this is in megawatt hours. Dr. Stevens explained this before. The numbers here across our three scenarios are roughly 2 million megawatt hours, 2.5, and over 3 million megawatt hours. These are annual values once again. In the report, we go into a little greater detail on this. It's not really the best comparison, but it is useful, at least in my mind, to compare how much energy we're generating and what that kind of means. We know that these projects would be on local schools or churches and supplying power to those entities specifically. But as a point of reference, we said, how many households would this power and what might that mean? And so just as a very quick and minor point of reference, in our highest scenario at 2 gigawatts, we're basically talking about powering the equivalent amount of homes in the entire city of Miami, right? So we're basically, point being, is talking about a lot of electricity that could be added to the grid through PPAs. Next slide. And as I mentioned, we did some greenhouse gas mitigation type scenarios. This is in million tons. I won't read the numbers for you, but maybe the more intuitive variable here is our greenhouse gas equivalency, equivalent cars taken off of the road on the right-hand side of your screen. Again, we're not actually literally taking those cars off of the road, but they're really good variables to share with folks and say, hey, this is a lot of pollution mitigation as well. In addition to supporting local jobs and wages and all of those types of things that I talked about, we're also feeling positive environmental and pollution related impacts. Basically, through our three scenarios respectively, we're taking the equivalent of over 88,000, 118,000, and nearly in our highest scenario, 150,000 cars off of the road respectively. Next slide. So just to wrap things up real quick here, and we'll segue to Q&A as sort of a conclusion type slide. As Dr. Stevens mentioned, and talking about sort of how PPAs work, going through our case studies, there is a multitude of benefits that are very clear for nonprofits and other types of organizations if PPAs were easier to do in Florida, right? From an economic impact perspective, as I talked about, really compelling values in terms of job growth, wages supported, which are in the report, total economic impacts, new dollars into the state. One really cool thing that we can also do is take a look at what's called the multiplier variable and think about, as I mentioned, sort of the direct, indirect, and induced job categories, right? And basically what we can say is for every direct job, either constructing or operating and maintaining a solar energy facility through our deployment scenarios, basically what we're doing in the state of Florida is supporting an additional 2 jobs across the state, which is really great. As I mentioned, local electricity generation, we're lowering pollution by this clean energy transition. And really, I think, one of the important things about this report and about this entire campaign is, sort of seen in the report in our introductory sections. We're talking about what PPAs are and educating folks about how this might work, going through these case studies. And for the first time ever, really important, we have tangible numbers, right? We sort of knew anecdotally that PPAs would provide a lot of value to the state of Florida, but now we have numbers that can be used in discussions with policymakers, politicians, other key stakeholders across the state to say, hey, these are the actual impacts that we're projected to see if we do legalize PPAs. So on the right-hand side of your screen, you'll see we also have this really nice one-page summary sheet, sort of a synthesizing one-pager of our economic and environmental impact models at the state level that I just talked about. So folks can print that off and use that as sort of this is the key data from the report. But I'd also encourage folks to check out the report. It's pretty short. It's about 20 pages and read through that. The link is down here, and I'm sure Heaven and Liz can talk a little bit more about this. There's a lot of documents on this webpage. Our full report, we have this one-page overview, a sign-on letter, and other things from Solar United Neighbors' perspective. Let's go to the last slide real quick. And yeah, thank you for listening. We're really excited to roll out this report and see where it actually goes in practice. Our email addresses are here on the slide. Encourage folks to reach out to us directly if you have questions, comments, feedback, other thoughts on PPAs in Florida or what we did in this report. And I will turn it back over to our moderators, and we'll be happy to answer questions right now as well.
Thanks so much. So a lot of questions about getting this recording. We are recording, and this will be sent around so that you have access to these slides to everyone who RSVP'd. And we are also going to send around a link to the report, the one-pager, the sign-on letter, as well as a little sharing template, if you will, that will help you spread the word about this to people who may be interested in getting involved. So much thanks to Dr. Stevens and Dr. Michaud. I think I did better that time, for their work on this and their participation in these webinars. They are such an amazing resource, and you'll see that even more so as we go through questions. We have a lot of questions, so I took some notes on trends that I saw or direct questions that I saw. And one thing that I wanted to share, we've had a lot of questions about how this works for the developer, and I completely understand this question. I actually attended a renewable energy conference a couple years back at the Seminole Tribe down in Broward County. It was a conference that they held, and it had tribes from all over both Canada and the US. And that really helped me understand this tax equity investor world, because it's really big for funding large-scale tribal projects. But before that, I was really struggling to understand it, and it's really difficult to understand. So all I can say is that the importance of tax equity investors and having the ability to use these tax credits cannot be overstated. So it's not something that, most of us on here, I don't think anyone on here is running a Fortune 500 company. If you are, please email me directly, and I will talk to you about how you can fund our work. But if we're not in that world and we're not desperate to eat up tax credits, then it is something that seems a little removed. But this is a great deal for them. This is a huge deal for them to be able to eat tax credits. And this is a low-risk investment. Renewable energy is seen as a low-risk investment. So a couple questions. One was, who are these people who are the PPAs? And I will provide a little bit of insight. Right now, Bank of America is one of the biggest tax equity investors in renewable energy, but that's an investor, right? So another PPA developer would be like First Solar. Anyone else have, any of the other panelists have anything to add to who these people are, who are the developers here? Okay. So generally, First Solar or companies that develop these projects, and that's kind of what they do. And they fall under kind of the same industry umbrella arm as solar installers. And we hope that we would have more here in our state if these were legalized. Can PPAs be off-grid? Here's another question.
that for us?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, can PPAs be off-grid? I think it depends. So I'm going to talk about the 3 individual case studies that we did. We did not estimate that they could generate more than enough electricity to support 100% of their demand. So not in our cases. I imagine that there are cases where you could. It would require a battery system as well, which, you know, you could probably also finance through the third-party PPA, but we didn't actually focus on that a whole lot. So again, I imagine that you can. I think in a lot of cases that's not going to be the case, but again, it might be dependent on each organization.
Okay. And can you explain the difference between a lease and a PPA and the benefits of a PPA over a lease?
Dr. Michaud, do you have something to add to that? That's not something I looked at extensively.
Yeah, I'd encourage folks to, you know, find resources online that talk about the differences. We very pointedly looked at PPA type models. There's a lot of other solar deployment type mechanisms. You know, solar leases is an option where you're basically leasing off your rooftop space to a developer. And I think go through the same sort of credit type transition systems. I'm not sure if the Solar United Neighbors folks have thoughts on this piece.
Yeah, I can speak to it a little bit, and Liz, if you want to add anything. We had a few questions on just PPAs versus leases in general. One of the big things that sticks out to me is that leases, you're paying a set amount for leasing the equipment. So that does not have production guarantees usually. So the PPA, you're actually purchasing kilowatt hours that you use right then and there. So there's a difference in what you're actually paying for. Do you have anything to add, Liz?
Yeah, I think that's my understanding. Someone, Drew, I think, followed up in the chat and said that you could have a lease that has a guarantee, but I thought that that was generally not part of the lease.
Okay, another question was if the models that you used are available. And I can share that we use some of these models in our work and just reporting our impact at Solar United Neighbors, and they are not extremely easy to use. And if this research were easy, then we would have done it, but we had to bring in bigger brains, those two being our additional panelists here. So they are generally available, correct?
Yeah, thanks, Evan. With the caveat that NREL, the National Renewable Energy Lab, so they have these job and economic development impact models and tools. They're pretty easy to use in terms of the platform. You don't have to download software. They're on Excel, but they're really complicated in terms of inputs, proxies, local wages. It's easy to sort of use and sometimes abuse these types of models and just plug in, okay, you know, X amount of kilowatts or megawatts, here's what we see. But a lot of these things need to be updated. And actually the solar PV model hasn't been updated for a few years. I'm really good friends with the NREL folks and I've talked to them about this. So there's a lot of things that are actually pretty dated at this point. So if folks have questions, I'm happy to answer more, but it actually was a pretty arduous process to update this and to make sure we're using the proper assumptions and inputs for these models. It's not as much plug and play as one might think.
Okay, do you have any other questions that you've seen, Liz?
There are lots of questions.
Yeah.
Heaven, did you already address, sorry, I'm trying to answer as many of them as I can. Did you already address the length of the PPAs at all?
No, we haven't addressed that like broadly and out loud. So generally a PPA, some of the finer contract details, we can speak in general terms, but it's going to be worked out for what works best for those parties. and ensures positive payback for the developer and the investor, but also results in savings for the host. Generally, they're 20 years, and correct me if I'm wrong, that's what was assumed here in the report as well.
Well, yeah, I'm not sure that I think the report actually doesn't really make an assumption per se about the length, right? Kelly, we just sort of use an estimate of the savings annually based on looking at some different data.
Exactly. Yeah. There's no time component really in the estimates that we did. So it's, so we didn't have to kind of establish what the time period would be. The reduced electricity rate we did assume for the case studies would be 25% lower than retail rates fixed over the 15 to 25 years. Oftentimes you see a price escalator. The escalation of the price will typically be lower than utility escalation. So it does, but we did not include that for simplicity. And it really, a lot of these rates are determined on a case-by-case basis. So we made a general assumption for every single case without knowing what exactly that would look like should they go through a PPA.
Yeah, that was a very purposeful decision, right? Like we acknowledge and you know, are mindful of the fact that this might be 15, 20, 25-year type PPAs or contracts that are signed, but erring on the side of simplicity, we you know, sort of calculated annual values, being agnostic to what we might see in practice. And that way folks can use those numbers depending on how long a contract might be.
Thanks. And I'll just add that, I mean, we're, again, one of only 7 states that are prohibiting PPAs right now. So this is tried and true. In so many other states, this is a commonly used financing mechanism that's really opened up solar savings and benefits to our focus here being municipalities, schools, NGOs. So we don't have to reinvent the wheel. That's the good part here. We know that this is a tried and true financing mechanism that works. So we're really just looking at conservative 3 different scenario numbers for what this could do for Florida.
Right, and we've seen, and I think the report talks about it some, and we look at those examples, but we're, you know, have seen savings of millions of dollars, you know, over a 20-year PPA for a school district. And there are some good examples in the Brighter Future report that Generation 180 created, and I can try to drop that in the chat with some specific school districts that took savings and invested in teacher pay, and I think the report mentioned some of those examples. What was it? There was a question around community solar and if this, if legalizing PPAs for munis and governments would impact community solar at all. Heaven, is that something you could address?
Yeah, no. For the sake of realism and trying to move Florida forward in a positive way, and having a huge impact, because we know that PPAs would not just have an impact on the hosts themselves. When we're talking about hosts that are schools and nonprofits, the impact's going to ripple out, right? The nonprofits are going to have greater capital that they can invest into their missions. Schools are going to have, you know, a lot of hard benefits like being able to save money and increase teacher pay, and soft benefits like school children being exposed to real life STEAM education. So we want to focus on that specifically because we think this is something that could happen in Florida and would be a positive step forward. Right now, I think community solar is maybe a little less likely, but those are actually, just to get to the root of like the legislative issue here, those are 2 different types of things that we're talking about here. So that would be virtual net metering, like peer-to-peer, that would need to be legalized for community solar to be enacted in Florida. I did want, since we're a little short on time, I wanted to make sure that I talk about next steps, and then we can continue to answer some questions. if there's anything big that we haven't covered. But immediate next steps, join that sign-on letter. So if you're here with an organization or a school or whatever it may be, and you're interested in staying in the loop, being involved, helping to move this forward, please join that sign-on letter, or maybe you know of an organization that would be interested. Share that with them. Liz has shared a lot of links, and then you can also just go to /Florida PPA and find it there, solarunitedneighbors.org /. And spread the word about the report. You can download it, share it. I mean, we had some big numbers, right? Like, these are really impressive statistics that we saw today that would mean a lot to our state at any point in time, much less right now during this pandemic and the crazy roller coaster that 2020 has been, when we've seen our fastest growing sector, the solar job sector is the fastest growing in Florida, be reduced by, you know, a third because of the pandemic. So this is really important to help revitalize our economy and reinvest into this sector. The sector employs a lot of women and 2% more veterans than the total workforce of the U.S. overall. So in Florida, it means a lot. And join our Solar Congress PPA campaign webinar on 10/20 next week about West Virginia and Florida. So we'll cover a little bit of what you've heard today, but really focus on West Virginia and what they've been doing. And it's going to be a great learning opportunity for state and a campaign that's been going longer than ours has. And then make sure that you get looped in with us so we can email you and keep you posted as the campaign develops. If you RSVP, then we will send out the slides as well as some next steps. And as we mentioned before, we're going to have like a little presentation that you can share and a little blurb that you can share about this. So we'll definitely hook you up so that you can be a activist, a solar activist, join our solar army, as we like to call it. I know the chat's blowing up. Were there any other questions that we should try to fit in the last minute, Liz?
We've had a couple. We just had another one about the, there were questions around like, oh, do you need to pass a constitutional amendment? And I tried to answer that like you could do that, and people may have tried to do, tried to do that in the past in Florida because they weren't sure they could get something through the legislature. That's mentioned in the report, but that sadly failed. And so we are attempting to go through the legislature. We are aware that FPL and Duke are very powerful and they are not excited about this. We would like to think that, you know, we can build the power through nonprofits and governments and schools that want to go solar. And in the midst of an economic crisis, we could, you know, say, well, you know, up to $3 billion, $4 billion in economic impact in Florida, how can you say no to this? So, you know, I think we're hoping it can get traction, but it's definitely going to be a hard road to hoe. Heaven, I don't know if you want to talk more about that.
Yeah, I mean, that's why we need you. That's why we need your help and you to help us spread the word and get people involved and get people caring. I believe wholeheartedly that this is not a partisan issue, and polls have shown, so many polls from all over, that solar has bipartisan support. And we saw that, right, in 2015, 2016, with the defeat of Amendment 1. Solar has overwhelming bipartisan support. This makes sense. It makes sense for combating climate change and sea level rise. It makes sense for our economy. It makes sense across the board. So I think that there is a chance to have a really strong partnership all over, and maybe some utilities would be friendly towards PPAs. I mean, it's definitely doing the right thing for the community and can help them meet some community goals. And we're talking about a long-term financing mechanism here, right? We said 20 years on average is the contract term. So in 20 years, we know that utilities are looking forward and they're trying to make sure that they are changing with the needs that we have. And one of those needs specifically here in Florida is resilience and increased resilience. I know that a representative from JEA was on earlier. They are doing something novel in that they have a battery rebate right now. So looking to the future, definitely within the next decade, we're going to see potentially utilities, they're already doing this in other states, looking toward people who have batteries, and PPAs could have a huge, that could be a huge source of battery power. And they're going to be looking to help offset peak demand and be more resilient using customer-owned batteries, perhaps. So there's a lot of good that could come from this, both now and in the future, and in kind of the next wave of technological improvements to the grid. Great. If you have any lingering questions, you can definitely email us at floridateam@solarunitedneighbors.org. And if it's directed to Liz, I'll make sure it gets to her too. And hopefully everyone learned a lot today and can share the word. Thank you so much to Dr. Stevens and Dr. Michaud for being here. And thanks everybody for attending and all of your great questions.
Yeah, thanks everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.